So, how did you come up with the idea to document, something like the Chola and the Nathula incidents of 1967?
I realized thereafter that a lot of people hadn't known about Nathula and Chola. And the more I dug into it, the more I realized that military scholars, military officers, army officers, veterans, very few were aware of it. And I can stick my neck out and say that nobody was aware of it. Nobody knew of it.
The Camouflage, it covers a very fascinating period straight from the First World War to 2611 in 2008. And you've spoken about these 10 brilliant people. If you could share with us if one or two personalities which stand out according to you and why.
Is of Hardeep Singh Malik and Laddie Roy, who were among the five first Indian fighter pilots. We've forgotten about them, but Laddie Roy was named the ace in First World War. And ace was somebody who could down seven or more enemy aircraft. Laddie downed 10 German aircraft and died at the age of 19.
Welcome to the Dialogues Digital. This is the Books and Banter section, and today we have with us Major Probal Dasgupta. He is an army veteran and he was commissioned into 511 Gorkha Rifles. Later joined several multinational consulting firms until he created his own Birdstone Advisors in 2023. He is also a very well known author on military history, and his first book was published in 2020, The Watershed 1967, India's Forgotten Victory over China, followed by the second one, which was beautifully titled Camouflaged Forgotten Stories from Battlefields, which came out in 2023, and is recently published and already a bestseller, General Brass Tacks, the Sundarji story, which was published this year. Welcome to the show, sir.
Thank you. It's such a pleasure being here, Portia. Look forward to our discussion.
So let's start by asking you that what brought about your journey. How has it brought you from the barracks to the corporate boardroom?
Right. Thank you. Great question to start with. Well, it was so. Let's take a step back. So, my father served in the army. He saw the war, the 1965 war. He was in the Sialkot front, and he was inside Pakistan. And I would hear stories from him. He had left the army and had become a banker later. But I, when I joined the army, I followed in his footsteps. I joined the infantry. I was with the Gurkhas. I served for 10 years and had the privilege of serving with some of the finest officers who went on to become uh, chief and the CDS of the Indian Army, General Bipin Rawat, General Rakesh Sharma, and several other colleagues, seniors, juniors, everyone. So I think that laid the foundation for the subsequent career that I undertook. So after I had served for 10 years, I wanted to, do something else. And, but I think, what happens is when you wear the uniform and you step out of it and do other things, you can never completely disassociate. So, I went to the US, I did my master's in New York in international affairs. But the fact is, I was always interested in the geopolitics in the region, and that led me back to doing what I did in terms of writing. But in between, I went into the corporate world, and I still continue to have one foot there in the form of my own firm. However, when I started writing, I realized that a lot of these stories hadn't been told, and which are linked to our history, the journey of a nation in several ways, in more ways than one. And I think somewhere it led me back to uh, rediscovering my roots in the army, as well as understanding what that meant in the context of a nation's journey. That's why you will see, my books that you recounted. The first was on India and China, 1967, which actually laid the foundation for the relationship of the two neighbors to follow for over half a century. And after 1967, the Chinese never launched into an attack against India, and that changed a lot of things for the two neighbors. And I say that we India and China, 33% of the Earth's GDP, 24% of the population, or 20%. Uh, and here were two battles. There were watershed battles that had not been spoken about. So my understanding of uh, of operations, my understanding of what it means to wear the uniform and the role of the army was sort of welded into my the other journey of being a historian and a writer, and that kind of helped me to understand the context of the role of the military and the role of some of these conflicts in that time in the context of the nation's history. So the second book you spoke about, Camouflage, that also talks about 10 of these stories starting from 1910 to 2010, about 100 years. So I call it 100 years, 10 stories, one book. So I think that talks about the nation in terms of these 10 stories. The current book, General Brass Tacks, is again about someone who had not been written about, though I call him the most important general, the most important military leader that India has had in contemporary history, given the fact that he influenced a lot of the political decisions of the country in the 1980s for an entire decade. Uh, well, we speak about Manekshaw and several other generals in chiefs who have had their impact on the nation for a decade. And 90s explosive events, a stormy decade about it. And at the center of it was is to reveal to myself, as I discovered while taking the journey of research as a writer, and to the others, um, the some of these forgotten events of history, which I don't necessarily categorize as military events alone, because they're also events of that pertain to our nation's past, and they're important to understand how we have reached where we have reached now.
Thank you, sir. Inspirations are best when it always starts at home, and it was wonderful here that your father played such an important role in your perceptions. Uh, you know, while Pakistan and China are two countries and subjects which most Indians, whether it is policymakers or homemakers or students, they've all been curious about, I would say. Some of the topics that you have touched upon are very sensitive, and you hardly get to read about them except in military journals and newspaper articles or oral history. So, how did you come up with the idea to document, something like the Chola and the Nathula incidents of 1967?
Yeah. So, Poshe, what happened was, while growing up, I would hear stories about Nathula and Chola from my father, and that set the initial pattern of things to come. But I realized, but that had been long forgotten. It was there in the recesses of my memory. 2017, it was when I was sitting with a friend in Hyderabad discussing the Doklam incident, and we were having lunch, and he said, "Well, during Doklam, the Chinese have put pressure on India, and it's going to be the same story." I remarked to him that, well, we must travel back 50 years. The last time India and China clashed, it was India who had put it across China, and after that, the Chinese have never ventured into an attack again. There has never been an India China conflict after 1967, barring the odd skirmish. He was quite surprised. I realized thereafter there are a lot of people hadn't known about Nathula and Chola. And the more I dug into it, the more I realized that military scholars, military officers, army officers, veterans, very few were aware of it. And I can stick my neck out and say that nobody was aware of it. Nobody knew of it, either in the army cantonments or in the civilian hierarchy. None of the ecosystems knew about it. And Watershed 1967 thus became the first and the only book about India's victory over China in 1967. The one thing that the book uh, reveals, which was a revelation to me as well when I wrote, was that it is not just a military victory, but it was a political outcome as well, because it shaped the political destinies of the two countries And in 1971, apart from a host of other reasons as to why China did not interfere in the India Pakistan war in the East, one of the reasons why China did not interfere and did not cut India out at the Siliguri corridor, which has a narrow 22-kilometer breadth, was 1967. And I have argued that at several forums because that was not written about. So, to your question, why I wrote about, the India-China events of 1967 was also because, whenever I would go to discussions, whenever I would hear media debates, all of those discussions were pertaining to 1962, wherein India had had a setback. No one spoke about what had happened 5 years later, which is such a remarkable watershed in our history that had not been spoken about. And I thought, when I was writing the book, the first thing that I set down on paper was this book will be called Watershed because it was a political watershed, it was a military watershed, it was a historical watershed, and was also a watershed in several terms. 1967, after that, the Chinese have never it changed the way changed the course of the two nations. The Chinese never won a war after that, and India won the wars that followed after that. So there were two different destinies that took shape, and therefore that book was in more ways than one just a military victory. It actually shaped the destinies of two nations for over half a century.
Wonderful, sir. Coming to the other book which you spoke about, The Camouflage, it covers a very fascinating period straight from the First World War to 2611 in 2008. And you've spoken about these 10 brilliant people. If you could share with us if one or two personalities which stand out according to you and why.
Right, right. So another thing that I wanted to also add to the previous question and kind of links up
Sure.
to this one as well is that after I wrote Watershed 1967 and it did very well, we sold the rights of the movies, we did several other things. So people thought there would be more books on China. What I wanted to do was to break away from the mode and discover areas which had not been addressed. That was the root, the genesis of the second book. That well, there was a China India clash. There was a China event of 1960s. I'd addressed that to the best possible manner that I could. And that book had done well. Everybody read it, and all of that had happened. So they expected another China book. So this time I moved away from the India-China subject, which I wanted to. And I said, there are several other areas which we haven't addressed appropriately. One of the things that struck me was that, the role of the Indian Army in not just shaping the nation of the last 100 years, but also when we talk about the coming of the New World Order in 1945, after the
Right.
Second World War. We speak about the role of the Americans, the British, and the French and allies, but we do not talk about the roles of the Indian soldiers in actually shaping the Allied victories in 1914 to 19 in the First World War and the Second World War in 1945. Uh, so a lot of those victories were on the back of Indian soldiers. 1.5 million Indian soldiers fought in the First World War, which was more than the
Wow.
combined Yes, more than the combined strength of Scotland, Ireland, and Wales. And there was a time when every third soldier in the British Army was an Indian soldier. So in the Second World War, about 2 million soldiers fought again in the Second World War, and these were all ghosted. They were all forgotten. I said,
Forgotten.
well, yes, and I said, well, they the role of the soldier in building the nation starts from some time before that. And when we talk about the New World Order, India had a role. And India had a role on the back of these soldiers who fought in different places across the face of the earth. And that's why it starts with 1910. You spoke about some of these stories that formed this book. Again, I call it Camouflaged, and I call it Forgotten Stories from Battlefields. Forgotten stories from battlefields that shaped the destiny of the nation and also of the world order. So the first story is of Hardeep Singh Malik and Laddie Roy. who were among the five first Indian fighter pilots. We've forgotten about them, but Laddie Roy was named the ace in First World War. An ace was somebody who could down seven or more enemy aircraft. Laddie downed 10 German aircraft and died at the age of 19. When he was
Wow.
buried in France, the German forces stopped the war to let the French priest, who they had called, carry out the ceremonial burial of Laddie Roy. The Germans had stopped the war. The Germans had stopped the attack. So they had so much respect for their enemy, Indralal Roy, Laddie Roy. And then there's the story of Hadith Malik, who uh, who again takes to the skies, who goes and plays cricket in UK. And these are what I wanted to point out was these are regular people who had lifted themselves to extraordinary deeds. And regular people, Hadith Malik went to England, played cricket, and played good cricket. He played for Sussex. He played in the team of Ranjit Singh Ji there. And the book starts with Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who was the creator of Sherlock Holmes, bowling to Hadith Malik.
Yeah.
So the idea was to present the regular amidst the public memory. The Hadith Malik story amidst the public memory of First World War, which we all know, but we do not know the story of Hadith Malik and the role he played. So Malik's story is quite incredible because Malik fights, has a duel with a German pilot, and both of them crash on either side. Malik comes back after the war. He survives the crash. He lands his plane on a swamp and is riddled with 300 bullets. He has a fight with the German pilot. Um, so so that thereafter the war ends and Malik comes back and he joins the diplomatic corps and goes on to become the Indian ambassador to France and Canada. Ardit Malik retires after 6 decades in public service. That is after his exploits in the First World War as a fighter pilot. After he leaves the diplomatic corps and retires, his biography is written by somebody else. One day, the biographer comes to him and says, "Sir, I have a surprise for you." Ardit Malik asks him, "What is the surprise?" So he says, "Well, I want you to meet somebody." He introduces him thereafter to somebody special. It's that German pilot who had also
Oh,
survived that crash in the First World War while fighting Malik. And they both meet after 6 decades. Both were in their 80s. Both had survived the war after had
Wow.
a blast. So these are stories that have a twist at the end.
Absolutely.
So there are
And certainly a silver lining.
yes, yes. So we have some of these stories in the book which are so I prefer to not write linear stories because they're predictable. Here are stories that would engage people. The aim was to take these stories out of the cantonments, take these stories to people, so that people read it not as military stories, but stories of our nation. And I would always categorize it as stories of our nation. They're not military stories, hanging around in some planet which we cannot fathom. But these are stories of us, the nation, and us. And these are all people amongst us. There's a story of Shivang Renchin, a 17-year-old boy who decided to take up arms when the Pakistani raiders came in 1948. Shivang Renchin joined the Indian Army and as a 17-year-old, and he fought the Pakistanis. Thereafter, he fought and he defended Ladakh with his band of 30 people.
yeah.
Because when the Indian Army was in Leh, uh, the army had asked at a meeting as to which among the villagers would be ready to join and defend. They were very scared because the Pakistani army was known to be coming down the hills.
Mm.
There was a 17-year-old boy whose hand shot up, and that was Shivang Rinchin. Rinchin would go on to fight 4 wars and did not lose a single one of them. He was a Mahavir Chakra Bar and a Sena Medal,
Wow.
which is rare. So Rinchin's story starts at the age of 17, and he served the entire time, and he left as he retired as a colonel. Some of these stories are ones that were planned. some of them were, the others were not. I was sitting at a lounge in Delhi when I get to meet somebody who said my father fought in the Second World War, and he was imprisoned by Rommel and his forces, and he was put in Germany. He escaped prison once, and he was caught in Italy and brought back. He survived a firing squad, a lot of these things, and he wrote each diary, each day of his life in prison into a diary. So I said, "Where's the diary?" So we brought out the diary. It was in Punjabi, and so we had to sit down and and Punjabi and partly in English as well. So he had joined as a soldier and served in Africa and had got captured. But he had written this entire diary of his 5 years during the Second World War into you know and kept it. So we translated that we, with the help of his son, he helped translate it into Hindi and English, and I rewrote it into a story, Three Lives of Charan Singh Dhillon. He retired as a colonel, but some of these stories are quite rare. Many of them were not published. Some of them were published but not known very well. There are stories after independence, in the China War and in the 1990s. So all of these stories kind of, through their protagonist, kind of tell us which era India was going through, what was happening. The later stories of 1990s and the early 2000s are those of insurgencies where the adversary who was far away in Europe and elsewhere had come to our door and were fighting us. And the last story is about the Mumbai attacks of 26/11. And I again, it's not a linear story because the story toggles between Manesar and Mumbai. Why Manesar? Because the wives of the energy commandos are also part of the story. This was the first time the wives were watching their husbands fight live on television, and also news appears that one of them has been killed. So I wanted to capture the emotions, the trauma, and also the narrative of the wives who were in Manesar watching their husbands fight in Mumbai. And, you know, uh, the whole journey of talking to sources, hearing their stories, to me, that was revelatory, and that kind of is quite something that I had not encountered, because you hear sources talk about all of these stories, and then you put them into a form of a book. But these are stories which are rare, which covers a lesser side of battles, human side of battles, wherein the families are also involved. And like I said, Hadith Malik and his adversary also have a story on the side of the war, which talks about the human connect that they had established many years after the war.
Thank you, sir, for that detailed briefing. And before I briefly touch upon your latest publication, I just want your quick take on the timing of your latest publication, Brass Tracks, because given the contemporary times, the concept of strategic stability becoming of so much importance, and, how much relevant it is to understand nuclear deterrence. What would you like to say about the timing of your publication?
So again, good question, Portia. Um, when you write a book, the idea is to publish it when it's complete. But sometimes, it just happens to be at the right time. When I wrote the first book, it came out in February 2020, March 2020, and the Galwan incident happened in June.
Correct.
And then everybody said, "Oh, this is the only book that talks about India and China. It's the latest book on the table," and the book suddenly took off. So people asked me, "Did you write the book with this in mind?" I said, "No, no, no. Look, this book appeared earlier. The Galwan incident
Yeah.
happened later. The happenstance. This is what I would think, and it just happens to weave in. And we live in a neighborhood, Portia, where we are always in the middle of such thinking. So I would think, yes, it has come out at a time when we are in the middle of, talking about deterrence, the nuclear, we talk about strategic autonomy, we talking about the neighborhood, uh, and all of the India-Pakistan issues. Having said that, I think we've always been in this neighborhood. We have always had adversaries around us. It's a very unique neighborhood that we have. We cannot choose our neighbors, but we need to figure out how to
Exactly.
deal with it. So I think mm, to your question, it comes at a time when we more we need to focus on how we need to address the neighborhood, how do we look at the adversaries, which are India and China, because this book of General Sundarji actually talks about how uh, we had dealt with the Chinese threat in 1986
Yeah.
87, and also Pakistan. There are two things that he talks about with Pakistan, and this is where his legacy becomes so relevant today. And we're discussing this book today in with respect to Pakistan, with respect to China. With respect to Pakistan, General Sundarji had laid down this term, punitive deterrence. With
Right.
respect to China, he called it dissuasive deterrence. If you look at the thinking that we have with the two adversaries in the neighborhood, they are again an extension of this expression that he had coined about 40 years ago. So I think we have been continuing with the similar kind of adversarial relationship in our neighborhood, and the book provides us a basis of what happened and how we have gone about it over the years.
Right. So, it's still on the table and people are still reading about it, these books, and, reviews are being worked on. But, among many positive reviews, one particular critique highlights that, how you focused on the strategic failure of signaling for India. How would you respond to that as an author?
So, can you come again? Strategic failure of?
Signaling.
Yeah. Okay. So, you know, well, the, uh, you mean for this book, from the book you said?
Yeah, from the books, from basically the biography. Yes, that you highlighted more on, let's say, failure of the strategic signaling, if that comes across better.
Ye- Yes. So, what I have highlighted here in the book, for instance, is that, General Sundarji was very much a grand strategist. As far as China and Pakistan were concerned, China, he managed to read the room very well with China. And I would rather say that, as far as China and Pakistan were concerned, his strategic signaling was spot on. And I'll come to where we had faltered. But as far as China is concerned, 1967, the Chinese had, you know, pressurized India, Nathu and Chola, and India gave it back. So that is one part. 20 years later, at the at in the general area of where the Chinese had begun the 1962 war, China started to apply psychological pressure on India in Somdurungchu, which was in the area of Thagla
Yeah.
and Namkachu. General Sundarji, why I talked about 1967 is that General Sundarji understood General Sagat's approach towards the Chinese. And therefore, his signaling was that, well, we must occupy the heights that surround the Chinese, because the Chinese had come to a certain place near the valley of Somdurungchu, and there were suddenly 200 Chinese troops, and they were creating a helipad. General Sundarji, not to be uh, not to be held back, and he decided to bring an entire brigade, heli-lifted a brigade to Zimithang, and which was unheard of. So his strategy against the Chinese was to take the initiative and not respond to their movements. That was what he had broken away from the past of defense in depth approach, which we had with China. That we didn't hold the front as strongly as we should have, but we held defenses in depth. General Sundarji changed that and changed that into a defensive offense, where an offensive defense, where he had troops on the heights, and suddenly, after 25 years, the Indian army was sitting on the heights and the Chinese were on the floor, and they were dominating the Chinese.
Hmm.
If you take your mind back to the action on Kailash Heights in 2020, it was very similar, where the Indian army had acquired the advantage of occupying the heights and thus pushing the Chinese onto the floor of the mountain and dominated the Chinese positions. So he understood the Chinese very well. He was very good with the grand strategies and the classical, you know, warfare approach with Pakistan and China. Against Pakistan, he realized that the Pakistanis had done very well in Punjab, traditionally in Punjab. And so, therefore, his strategy was to hold Pakistan and Punjab and use two strike corps to launch a deep, incisive thrust into the deserts and take out the Kahuta nuclear facility, which had been a fledgling one in 1980s. So his vision was to cut out or dismantle the Kahuta nuclear facility, which would push back Pakistan's nuclear program by many decades, if not a few. So that was that. The strategic signaling that India faltered in was in certain complex areas, which included Sri Lanka and the Punjab militancy, Blue Star, for instance.
Correct.
Why so? Yeah, why so? And I would, there is also the tendency to blame General Sundarji for Blue Star. I don't blame him entirely for Blue Star as much as I blame the political dispensation for bringing the situation to such a pass that the final, or sort of the inevitable operation was laid at the army's door. What I fault General Sundarji for in Blue Star was to bypass the Chief General Vaidya and have a direct line with Mrs. Gandhi to obtain her decision in launching Blue Star. Blue Star did not end in a victory for anyone, and it left General Sundarji with a deep scar throughout his career and life. And so, again, Blue Star was a complex insurgency, complex issue that we decided to, you know, not address as Bindranwale became a very, very fierce and dangerous militant. As far as Sri Lanka was concerned, it was somebody else's war. I've also called it India's Vietnam. Wrong signaling because it was amongst stakeholders that had nothing to do with India. You had the locals, Jaffna Tamil movement, and you also had the Sinhalese, the local government. There were stakeholders there. India was not supposed to be going there. India was fighting somebody else's war, one. Second, the planning was completely off the mark. India was supposed to go in as peacekeepers and became peace enforcers overnight. When the Prime Minister asked General Sundarji, how long would we take if the LTTE, which was led by Prabhakaran, the Tamil militant movement, would fight the Indian army? So General Sundarji remarked it would not take more than 2 to 3 weeks, which was again an inappropriate and I think an ill-considered assessment of the adversary's capabilities. In the Golden Temple, they had misread the adversary's capabilities, given that kind of the kind of strength that the militants had mustered up inside the Golden Temple. Lack of intelligence again. Sri Lanka was lack of intelligence because India's several bodies, whether it was the intelligence, the military, the political dispensation, were all functioning in different directions, which is why the strategic signaling in Sri Lanka was completely off the mark, and it left with not such a great experience for India, not such a great memory, and it also laid bare Sundarji's inability to, sort of hear other views. It was at the back end of his career, and I called it hubris as well. Much as I talk about General Sundarji being a brilliant general and he's profound, he also leaves behind a disputed legacy. He was the most important general of that time, and his views, his transformative ability, still is a part of Indian thinking today. Having said that, I didn't want it to be a hagiography. I want it to be a balanced biography which addresses the profound depth of General Sundarji's thinking, as well as identifies where we went wrong in strategic signaling and some of these decisions that we did undertake in the 1980s.
Thank you, Major Probal, for such a detailed account of your work. It's made me also thinking in so many ways, given that I'm an international relations student and there's so many things to learn on. You not just have a fresh perspective, but I must commend you on the choices of themes that you have worked on. It must have taken a different kind of a viewpoint to reach this stage. And congratulations once again on your latest book, and I'm sure there'll be many takers. If it was in my powers, there is a thought that people say that this book would only be suitable for history and political science and international relations students. I would certainly say this is a great book for psychology students. I think military history and decision making is something that works great for psychology to understand. It's a practical example and it's happened. So, once again, all the very best, and thank you for being with us on Books and Banter.
Thank you very much, Dr. Portia. It's such a pleasure being here. Thanks for having me over.